Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to this, the second in this year's Research Group in Constitutional Studies lecture series and debate series. The lecture series is sponsored by the Jan P. Lynn Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds, of which the Research Group on Constitutional Studies is a part, and is supported in part by grants from the Institute for Liberal Studies and the John Dobson Foundation. The Research Group on Constitutional Studies brings together scholars in political theory and political philosophy, public law, constitutional law, and legal theory, and constitutional level political science from across McGill, ranging from faculty through postdocs and graduate students to a student fellowship for master's students and undergraduates. It also includes occasional visiting faculty positions, including the visiting Fulbright Chair in Constitutional and Political Theory, of which Teresa Bejan is this semester's holder. The Lynn Center supports humanistic social inquiry, engaging in historical, normative, and spatial social science across disciplines and faculties at McGill. And the RGCS lecture series has, for nearly 10 years now, aimed to bring leading researchers in multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary areas surrounding political theory to McGill, in this case, this year, virtually to McGill, to speak to broad audiences that include advanced undergraduates on the expectation that people who are excellent researchers are also capable of being excellent teachers and are able to present their cutting-edge research in ways that are accessible to student audiences. And the lecture series emphasizes talks on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society, drawing on political theory and philosophy, law, also history, economics, and political science. Teresa Bejan is our first ever return RGCS lecturer, because in her capacity as visiting Fulbright Chair in Constitutional and Political Theory, she automatically gives one, having given one already a couple of years ago. We're delighted to have her back again. Teresa Bejan is Associate Professor of Political Theory at Oriel College and a Fellow at Oriel College of Oxford University. She is one of the leading, most creative, and most original political theorists of her generation. Something that was confirmed by her receipt earlier this year of the British and Irish Association for Political Theory Early Career Prize. Her scholarship is primarily centered in early modern political theory, but without ever losing sight of the importance of good history of political theory work for understanding contemporary normative questions. She is consistently interested in bringing the history of political thought into engagement with the history of religious thought and religious practice, interested in putting familiar canonical thinkers into conversation with less familiar and more routinely neglected figures, including Mary Estelle and Roger Williams. And interested, I think, always in finding ways to subvert what she characterized in one essay, the tendency for political theorists to return to the history of political thought in order to uncover a path that teleologically leads to the theorist's own current works in progress. Bejan's scholarship in the history of political thought aims rather to unsettle and discomfort contemporary theoretical pieties. And this is true for her work on freedom of religion, her work on civility, her work on freedom of speech, and in the project she's now working on, of which today's lecture will be a part, her project on equality. She's the author of many scholarly articles and of the widely and justly acclaimed book, Mere Civility, as well as a number of works facing the public sphere, and was the speaker in the only TED Talk that I ever watched from beginning to end. It is a real pleasure to welcome Teresa Bejan, who is, by the way, physically at McGill, having exerted great effort to make her way to Montreal to take up the Fulbright chair and to make her way into campus where she can speak to us, today. Great pleasure to welcome Teresa Bejan back to the Research Group on Constitutional Studies. Thank you, Teresa.
Great. Well, thank you, Jacob. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this all working? Okay. I am now going to endeavor to share my screen because under COVID conditions, lamentably, I will be using a PowerPoint. So bear with me for just 1 second. Is that working, Jacob? Okay, great. And there we go. All right, so it's great to see you all, and it's great to see names, if not faces. But anyway, it's really a delight to be here, and I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today on what is going to be the first substantive chapter in the book that I'm currently writing. My topic today, as the title suggests, is equality, or more precisely, it's what we mean when we apply the concept of equality to human beings. Now, as many of you will know, political theorists and philosophers tend to apply the concept of equality to human beings a lot. Indeed, Ronald Dworkin liked to describe the basic equality of human beings as quote unquote axiomatic. So for Dworkin, the idea that human persons were one another's equals, and that's a phrase I take from Jeremy Waldron, it functioned as the underlying major premise of all modern political theories, from liberalism to utilitarianism to socialism. That was Dworkin's claim. And again, those of you here assembled will know that political theorists and philosophers don't tend to agree on very much. Certainly, we don't agree on what basic equality means or what its consequences should be for social, political, and economic arrangements. But nevertheless, Dworkin's claim that a commitment to equality is the hallmark of philosophical and political modernity, well, that claim has been pretty widely accepted. As Richard Arneson has put it with sort of beneficial bluntness, quote, claims about basic human equality, he tells us, mark a divide in moral thinking between a pre-modern world, in which nobles were regarded as having greater worth than peasants, to a modern world that repudiates these crude prejudices, unquote. Now, as a historian of political thought myself, I'm always struck by how even the most ostensibly ahistorical political philosophers, including people like Dworkin and Arneson, more and less explicitly rely on certain just so stories about when the idea of the basic equality of human beings came about. And that story, those just so stories actually do concrete work in their arguments. For instance, the idea that basic human equality is definitively modern as a political premise is meant to actually save us from the trouble of actually having to argue for it, right? So to use Rawlsian language, we get to include basic human equality as among our considered judgments, on the basis of which we then can reason to our more controversial conclusions about justice. And on this view that we moderns seem to know better than those poor, benighted denizens of pre-modernity, well, that might as well be a happy accident. But again, it's a happy accident. So really, we're just lucky and we can get on with things. But of course, it won't surprise maybe some of you in the audience to learn that the just so stories told by Arneson and Dworkin about basic human equality as a characteristically modern premise are false. Not only has modernity produced plenty of its own crude prejudices, including forms of scientific racism and sexism that were wholly alien to pre-modern eras, the idea that human beings are equal, in fact, dates back over a millennium. Right, so now we have slide 1. So here on this first slide, we see a 3rd century extract from the jurist Ulpian, which was collected in Justinian's Digest of Roman Law in the 6th century. So Ulpian attributes the principle that omnes homines aequales sunt to the 1st century Roman jurist Sabinus. And as we'll see in the rest of this lecture, the idea of human equality was widely embraced by Roman jurists and Christian theologians. That is, by precisely the pre-modern thinkers who nevertheless saw that human equality as consistent with hierarchies of all sorts, including many more, as we shall see, much more sophisticated than those entertained by Arneson. But before we take a look at the weird, wide world of equality before egalitarianism, as I call it, let's consider a contemporary political philosopher who has a much more historically nuanced account of basic equality. So many of you will have read works by Jeremy Waldron, including his latest called One Another's Equals. And in those works, he's argued that basic human equality as we know it is actually a product of the 17th century. So Waldron's favorite exemplar here is none other than John Locke, who described the state of nature in the two treatises of government as follows. So you see here on the slide, it's a state also of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction are reciprocal, no one having more than any other, there being nothing more evident than creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature and the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. So Waldron cites this passage repeatedly as the foundation of what he calls Locke's egalitarian theory of politics. And it's egalitarian in the sense that the fact that human beings are equal by nature is taken to mean that they are entitled to be treated as equals as well. So you'll see that in this passage, Locke explicitly denies the existence of any natural hierarchies between human beings, whether of subordination, so that means a kind of ordered degree of precedence among them, or of subjection. So there we have juridical distinctions of status and authority. And Locke therefore appears to treat human being status as equals as prior to and normative over any hierarchical relations or arrangements that human beings may subsequently introduce. Now, Waldron's well aware that Locke's arguments have a long prehistory in Jewish and Christian theology, specifically in the creation of both men and women in the image and likeness of God in Genesis. Right? God said, let us make man in our image and after our own likeness, and let him have dominion over all the earth. Now, Waldron concedes that this idea of human beings as occupying a distinctive and dignified rank superior to other created beings, specifically non-human animals, is historically compatible with and indeed supportive of hierarchies of all sorts. Nevertheless, Waldron insists, in the quote that I have for you at the second part of the slide, it is, quote, a striking implication of this sort of ranking that within each rank, everything is equal. And he goes on to suggest this is precisely what's going on in John Locke's work. But of course, Locke himself subsequently accepted many different forms of natural subordination as consistent with his theory in the second treatise, right? So here we have him listing all sorts of kinds of subordination that he takes to be consistent with the natural equality that he's explicated earlier in the second treatise. But it gets even worse, right? Elsewhere in Locke's works, he actually shows us that he accepts not only natural subordination, but the natural subjection of women, that is, of one sex to another one. Again, he seems to think this is consistent with the natural equality of human beings. Now, Waldron would hardly be the first political theorist or philosopher to dismiss the many different hierarchies or exclusions, whether of women or of slaves, embraced by so-called early egalitarians like Locke, as so much historical baggage, or, you know, in the favored phrase, as so many blind spots. But again, as a practitioner of what I would call historically informed political theory, as described by Jacob very generously, I'm really also struck by just not only the willingness, but also the alacrity with which my colleagues will jump to dismiss these hierarchically ordered exclusions as, and I quote here, philosophically uninteresting. That is, as though every time a historical figure otherwise committed to human equality doesn't come to the conclusions that a modern egalitarian expects, well, it can be adequately explained as a failure, whether of reasoning ability or more often of nerve, right? They simply give in to the prejudices of their time. Now, on this view, basic equality operates effectively as an idea without a history, beyond acting as a universal solvent on presumptively backward and historically contingent hierarchies, unless, of course, it is resisted or, in Samuel Fleischhacker's phrase, blocked by some atavistic impulse or religious dogma. And here Elizabeth Anderson has this wonderfully pungent phrase, the authoritarian doctrine of original sin. But for the authoritarian doctrine of original sin, well, all of the egalitarian consequences of natural equality would have just followed seamlessly. Now, this tendency, and it's a tendency that's evident even among historically sensitive commentators like Waldron, is, I think, symptomatic of a broader failure among historians of political thought to historicize the concept of equality. We too tend to treat it as an idea without a history, and we allow it to do quite a lot of implicit normative work in the historical narratives we offer. Still, equality, like liberty or toleration or any of the other grand abstractions to which we've subjected to ruthless genealogical scrutiny, carries its history with it. And its relationship with hierarchy, I'm going to argue, was and is much more complicated than our contemporary categories permit. So in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to argue that there was quite a lot of significant conceptual distance and many conceptual difficulties, as well as practical ones, in the way of converting what was in Christian political thought a politically inert commonplace, namely that omnes homines aequales sunt, into a pressing practical truth. So let's go back to the beginning. Not Latin, but Greek. Following Dworkin, modern egalitarians like to describe basic equality in the language of Euclidean geometry as axiomatic. But in Euclid's Elements, equality was defined narrowly as a relationship of exact correspondence or oneness between objects sharing a quantitative unit of measure. In the Metaphysics, and that's what I have for you on the handout, Aristotle likewise distinguished the equal, to ison, as a relation of oneness with respect to quantity, from the identical, to tauton, as oneness with respect to essence, and the similar, to homoion, as oneness with respect to quality. So we have three relations here, which are all aspects of oneness. So the technical quantitative sense of equality informs its common sense too. So if we turn to the politics, we see Aristotle reporting that the equal, to ison, was synonymous with the just, to dikaion. And it's important to realize here that the sense being invoked is that of the equal as the even or level. So the operative image here is of a scale evenly balanced between two objects of equal, that is quantitatively indifferent weight, right? So you have to imagine that scale. In his writings on justice, Aristotle famously distinguished between two kinds of equality or isoteta, arithmetic and geometric. Now, many of you will remember that the former, arithmetic equality, implies quantitative indifference, while the latter, geometric equality, connoted proportionality. And the distinction is sometimes dismissed by Gregory Vlastos and other commentators as simply a kind of sophistical move reflecting Aristotle's personal hostility to democratic justice. But to understand why Aristotle could make the move that he did and make this distinction in the first place, one needs to keep the association between the equal and the even or level, and also this governing metaphor of the set of scales or balance in mind. So accordingly, for Greeks like Aristotle, appeals to equality in politics place one firmly in the realm of weights and measures. And although one might assume that objects of equal weight should be of equal value, this is obviously false. So Aristotle is therefore able to argue that yes, justice is a kind of equality, but the scale metaphor ends up tipping the balance, if you will, toward that of geometric proportion, because those who are of strictly equal worth or merit are justly entitled to strictly equal shares, isomoira in Greek. Truly equal justice is going to demand that unequal shares go to those who are themselves unequal, anisotes, in value or merit. Now, of course, Aristotle, like Plato and Isocrates, who make similar distinctions, was, of course, theorizing equality in the context of an Athenian democracy in which practices centered around equality were really important. So we have not only isonomia, which is translated roughly as equal law, but as well as Isageria, which translates as equal public address. And so for those of you who were at my lecture 2 years ago, I banged on to you at length about Isageria, so I'm not going to say all that much about it here. But I do want to make just a couple points about isonomia and Isageria as practiced in Athens. Now, normatively, both of these ideals functioned as ideals of balance. That is, as institutions that were meant to balance or even out the different parts of the polis, that is, the rich, the poor, the noble, the base. And so effectively, these are ideals of kind of arranging institutions to counterbalance counterweights so that neither side overwhelms or outweighs the other part of the polis. And here again, I'll just observe that the kind of notorious exclusions in Athenian democracy are not incidental, but rather they're indicative. So as Mary Beard has pointed out, while women were generally excluded from Greek politics, democratic Athens, which was committed to giving every male citizen, regardless of his social background, a voice, simultaneously outdid all of the other polis in its effort to silence women. So it's not a blind spot to exclude women and women's speech from Athenian politics. It's really a crucial calibrating measure. The weight of men's voices, the weight of every, whatever Tom, Dick, or Yorgos has to say, is predicated on establishing the weightlessness of women's voices. So turning now from Athens to Rome, we find a similar set of conceptual distinctions in play. Like Greek, classical Latin distinguished between the equal, the same, and the like as aspects of unity or oneness, while the abstract noun equalitas likewise conveyed an ideal of balance, derived from the root equus, meaning level or even. In Rome, however, the primary site of equalitas was not politics, but the law, where it was closely associated with equitas and the scales of justice. Thus, again, in Latin, as in Greek, the equal could be a synonym for the just, and classical and post-classical commentators would follow Aristotle in noting that distributive justice demanded proportionality in delivering aequalia aequalibus, or equal shares to equals. Still, in Latin, we encounter a fourth relational property. And this property is based not on unity, but on plurality. This is the property of paritas, or parity. The origin of the word par is disputed. It may have originated in trade as a term used to describe two different things that were sufficiently similar in value to be commensurable or matching. So here we might think of a pair of shoes, and that really is the way to think about parity, as a kind of pairing or matching. Still, we can recognize parity today as the root of the modern English word peer, which came into English through medieval French, a fact that I'm going to return to a bit later on. So while Latin pares and aequales, like English peers and equals, could be used as synonyms or as rhetorical intensifiers, as we see here in the first passage from the Rhetorica ad Herennium, there are important conceptual differences between them as well. Unlike equality, which was based in a precise unity of measure, the sense of pares was crucially evaluative and rough. Paritas was conventional, and indeed often a social relationship of shared value or fitness, what's appropriate or proper, between things that were, strictly speaking, incommensurable, but nevertheless might be treated on a par. Thus, among human beings, as we'll see, parity of status could thus be compatible with differences both of quantity and of quality. So for example, in this first passage I have from Cicero, De Senectute, or of old age, at the bottom of this slide, we find Cato distinguishing between those who are aequales in age, that is in years, and those who are pares in rank or virtue, who, quote, congregate most easily with their peers, pares cum paribus. So I think it makes a lot of sense that parity should have come to the fore in Rome as a social concept in the late Republic and in the early Empire, as in the notorious phrase used to describe the Roman emperor as primus inter pares, or first among equals. And for those of you who are interested, the book I'm currently writing is called First Among Equals, and it's precisely exploiting this ambiguity in the difference between pares and aequales. Because as you'll see, that phrase, when it's translated into modern English, pares is rendered as equals. But what I want to show you in this slide and the next few slides is that the persistent conflation in modern translation and modern editions of Latin texts between equality and parity means that an important conceptual distinction has been lost, as it were, through translation. So partly what I'm trying to do in this project is kind of recover this complexity and show you that the difference in these concepts actually matters quite a lot. Okay. As we see in these further passages from Cicero, parity was often used to compare or relate individuals who were otherwise separated by profound social distance. So in the first passage from De Officiis, we have a parity of right, pari iure, connecting the higher and lower strata of society. And here in the second, Cicero describes the great Pompey as putting himself on a par with the lower classes. In particular, we can see in the sense in which there's a profound sense in which Roman citizens, despite their wildly different social and economic conditions, were seen at this stage as nevertheless being pares in a really important sense. So if we look here at Velleius Paterculus, he makes this point explicitly. So he's an early imperial historian writing during the reign of Tiberius, but he draws explicitly on this idea in his own description of Pompey. Of course, at the time Velleius was writing, the fiction that the emperor was simply primus among his senatorial pares was strained past all plausibility. Still, even in imperial Rome, there remained this sense that the essential parity or paritas of Roman citizens was reflected in their shared dignitas. And that dignitas had, as Jeremy Waldron himself has pointed out, had concrete social and legal implications. Citizens, no matter their wealth or standing, shared alike in bodily integrity and were exempt from corporal punishments. And of course, the corporal punishments in play here are things like crucifixion, to which foreigners and slaves were routinely subjected by the empire. So, keeping this distinction between equality and parity in mind, I want us to turn now, or rather return, to the first century jurist Sabinus and his claim that omnes homines aequales sunt. As you can see here, the complete claim is a little bit more complicated. According to Ulpian, Sabinus claimed that all humans were equal with respect to natural law. And he contrasted this explicitly with those who were slaves and therefore accounted for nothing under civil law. So clearly this isn't the egalitarian premise that a modern political philosopher would expect. There's no claim here that those who are equal deserve to be treated as equals. Rather, the claim is that insofar as we are all equally human, all human beings are, strictly speaking, indifferent. That is, indifferently obligated under natural but not civil law. Okay, so what does that mean? Here we have equality language, right? And we recognize this as putting us in the realm of balancing and weight. So to say that we are all aequales under natural law is to say that the law of nature weighs equally upon us. It binds us indifferently. And to give you an appropriately brutal example, the contrast here between the way that natural law obliges all of us equally versus the civil law, which obliges us differently or differentially. Every human being would be obligated under natural law to preserve himself, so the law of self-preservation, yet he who was a master, dominus, under civil law had the right to beat his slaves, and of course not vice versa. Right? So there we have differential obligation versus indifferent obligation. And here I think it's really fruitful to read Sabinus's juridical principle of equality as indifference, if you will, in light of contemporary Stoic ideas about human equality as an observation of natural species. In De Legibus, we famously find Cicero asserting the essential similarity of human beings as naturally sharing in reason and justice. So notice that the point here for Cicero, and I think you see there's a lot of Latin scattered around in this passage, but I'm sort of trying to show you what's going on, that in this passage, there's not really any equality talk in the Latin, but there is quite a lot of unity talk. And you also notice at the very end that Cicero says, even though we are clearly different in what we know, we are nevertheless on a par in our faculty of learning, our faculty of being taught. So for Cicero, the point is that human beings all fall equally under the definition of human being. We are all equally human with respect to being members of the same natural species. And so here we have a similarly uplifting Stoic account of human equality in Seneca, who likewise grounded our equality in man's equal, that is strictly speaking indifferent, vulnerability to death. It's not rough, It's precise. We are all equally vulnerable to death, and that pretty much sucks. But hey, at least we know on that basis that we're really equal. You know, it's depressing, but you know, this, in the 17th century, at least Hobbes would make a joke about it. Here, Seneca just presents it as a fait accompli. Okay, I'm belaboring this point for a reason. For Sabinus, as for the Stoics, man's unity with respect to natural species grounds a unity of obligation under natural law. And this is not, again, an egalitarian demand for equal treatment, let alone an evaluative assertion of strictly equal dignity or worth among human persons. Not only does the distinction between natural and civil law explain why mankind's equality by nature had so little in the way of this worldly consequences for so long, we can also see something else, namely that the traditional conceptual association of equality with ideals of balance and indifference explains why natural human equality, an idea, again, it's worth saying, which was wholly absent from a society like democratic Athens, which was radically inclusive as well as being democratic. Nonetheless, this idea of natural or basic human equality gained currency in the Roman Empire, and indeed in the late Roman Empire, with its ever multiplying legal distinctions, not only between slaves and free men, but an increasingly complicated and highly formalized system of ranks or orders, ordines, of Roman citizens. And indeed, later in the Roman Empire, we also get ordines of slaves. So you get slaves being ranked in terms of their dignity. So it would be wrong to suggest that Roman ideas of natural equality had no consequences. So this is really important. You know, it's not that nothing followed from the idea that human beings were equales. But where it did have normative force was, again, within the law. And here we need to remember that the primary meaning of equalitas in Latin, as in Greek, was as a principle of balance. So under civil law, the powers that happen to be should aspire to enact equalitas as a principle of impartiality in the administration of justice. And this was crucially in Rome reflected in the commitment to codifying the civil law by writing it down. So in recording the law and applying it equally or really equitably in every case, magistrates would be emulating the goddess Justitia's own equal judgment as an impartial judgment. And indeed, this is how we find the idea of equality entering into Christianity, which was, after all, a cultural product of the Roman Empire. While political theorists and philosophers like Jeremy Waldron tend to focus on Genesis and the creation of man, imago Dei, one of the most important New Testament proof texts actually for human equality was Acts 10:34, and also James 2:9, which is cited slightly less often. There we see Peter declaring to the Roman Cornelius that God is a prosopolemptes, or in Latin, non acceptor personarum. So the 1611 King James Version of the Bible translated this passage into English more memorably as God is no respecter of persons. And for those of you who were in attendance at my lecture about Hobbes last week, you'll be familiar with the literally revolutionary consequences that 17th century levelers, diggers, and Quakers drew from Acts 10:34 and the idea that God had sanctioned divine disrespect. But what does this actually mean, a prosopolemptes? Well, the Greek prosopon corresponds directly with the Latin persona as the face or mask that an actor would wear in the theater. So in Latin, though, persona became an important legal term, describing an individual or a corporation's public role or position vis-a-vis the civil law. Indeed, we've actually already encountered the central distinction in Roman law between those who were legal persons, that is, adult male citizens with full legal rights, which usually meant that their father had died, so they were no longer under the power of patria potestas, and those who were not, so slaves, women, children, foreigners, etc. So you get in the civil law distinction between persons and non-persons. So Peter's point in Acts, though, was that unlike under the civil law. One's acceptability to the Christian God didn't depend on their worldly status or face, that is, their age, sex, race, wealth, social status, or condition, but rather their spiritual merit. And this was a reflection of, indeed, divine equalitas. In God's eyes, every human being was, strictly speaking, indifferent and would be weighed accordingly. Of course, the idea that human beings are, unlike God, distracted by superficial differences is, of course, why justice must be blind. Now, again, sort of take a step back for those keeping up. The external sense of person that I just described to you is clearly at odds with the modern philosophical idea of personhood as an individual's internal capacity for moral agency, and to which, for many philosophers and theorists, our fundamental status as equals attaches. So sort of pre-modern persons are external, superficial, public-facing, and ordered. Modern personality is internal and strictly equal. But in early Christianity, as in Roman law, equality attached explicitly to humans as members of the same natural species. That is, not as individual persons. Persons were rather defined by their differential placement in various social, political, and economic hierarchies. So the ancient idea of personality is in direct tension with the unity or oneness with which, or on which ideals of equality were based. So again, if we want to understand this history in light of the kind of stories that contemporary theorists tell about the progress of equality, we're going to see here in this kind of migration of the person from the external face to the inward arena, we're going to see a kind of progress of basic equality as the process by which man lost his soul but gained a personality, right? Person sort of moves outside in. Again, you're going to notice, and Jacob alluded to this in his opening remarks, that not only am I doing some defamiliarizing here, I'm offering a deliberately deflationary reading of many of the key sources cited by philosophers like Waldron when they trace the high road of human dignity from Genesis to the Stoics to the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Still, notice that the story I'm telling is explicit and consistent with the only reference to man's creation in God's image and likeness in the New Testament. Right? So here in the book of Matthew, Jesus likens the image of God in man to Caesar's sovereign imprint on a Roman coin as a sign of our equal, that is, indifferent subjection to divine and civil authority, respectively. Accordingly, Christian commentators would often explicate man's creation imago Dei in terms of minting and coinage. Like coins of a common currency, all humans bear the same stamp. Nonetheless, they were not all of equal value. So again, here I'm going to make use of the distinction I introduced earlier between equality and parity. We can now see that although human beings might be equales by nature, they are nonetheless still disparata. That is, they are evaluatively distinct. So in other words, contrary to the expectations of modern egalitarians, natural equality did not dictate equal worth, and that it did not dictate sort of the rough comparability of parity. To see why this is so, we need to turn to an early Christian commentator who did, in fact, plead for the parity of human beings along with their equality. Okay, here on this slide, in the next few, I have passages from the 4th century Roman Christian author Lactantius, who he's not known very much, or he's not really much read today, but he was in fact an advisor to the Emperor Constantine, and during the Renaissance he was actually known as the Christian Cicero, but since then he's fallen on hard times. But here we go. Here's some excerpts from Lactantius's Divine Institutes. So in the Institutes, he argues at length, following Cicero explicitly, that justice is not only natural to human beings, but that it also includes the equability, the equabilitas, of submitting equally under the law. But Lactantius in this passage even goes further, arguing that the shared condition in which all human beings have been placed by God makes them pares, as well as omnes aequos. Moreover, if we transition to the next slide, Lactantius argues that neither the Greeks nor the Romans possess justice because of the vast disparities of rank and status among their citizens. For, and I quote, where all are not equally matched, universi pari, there is not equity, and inequality, inequalitas, of itself excludes justice, the whole force of which consists in making those pares who have been by an equal lot, pari sorte, arrived at the condition of this life. So this is certainly a far cry from Sabinus, let alone Seneca, on equality as indifference. Still, even Lactantius, as an early Christian, doesn't draw the conclusion that because humans are naturally pares, they should therefore be treated as peers. Rather, he argues that Christians should express their belief that they are pares by regarding and speaking to one another as brothers in spirit, fratres in spiritu, regardless of their different social conditions and statuses. So natural parity here doesn't therefore issue in a demand for social parity, let alone legal or political parity in the societies under which these Christians are living. Rather, it is offered as an antidote to sin, specifically the antidote to the sin of pride, to which fallen humans are fatally inclined. Moreover, Lactantius soon makes clear that natural parity is not a foundation for equality at all, but rather for spiritual superiority. So natural parity, he tells us, expresses itself in this world, in Christian shared lowliness or humility of spirit. Nevertheless, and I quote, in the sight of God, we are distinguished by virtue, and everyone is more elevated in proportion to his greater justice. Indeed, he who has conducted himself not only as pares, but even as an inferior, so in a minority, will plainly obtain a much higher rank of dignity in the judgment of God. Again, notice this altitudinal language is playing with this idea of the equal as the balanced or level, right? So again, we're having this balancing act. The faulty scale, which is out of balance in this world, is going to be counterbalanced and corrected in the world to come. The last will come first. Here in Lactantius, we encounter what's going to become a consistent theme in Christian treatments of natural equality, namely that the equality of human beings by nature is not a normatively egalitarian principle at all. Rather, it is a normatively hierarchical principle. It's not only compatible with, but really fundamental to the hierarchically ordered distinctions that early Christians, like their pagan counterparts, saw as governing heaven and earth, by which superiors rightly presided over inferiors. So to see why this is the case, I'm going to turn now to another very famous Christian discussion of natural equality in Gregory the Great's commentary on the book of Job. Here again, natural equality functions as a counsel to humility. According to Gregory, Job demonstrated his humility by submitting to God's judgment on an equal footing with his servants. And in this passage, we see equality as indifference working together with equality as balance. So he to whom all are equally subject, that is God, will apply his equal, that is his balanced, judgment to them in turn. So notice that Gregory, unlike Lactantius, is not suggesting that Job degraded himself to the equal status of his servants in this world, but rather that Job rightly remembered that their natural indifference would be the basis on which God would make just distinctions between them in the next world. Okay, still in this passage, as you'll see in the very last line, which is highlighted, Gregory appeals to the idea that defect is responsible for the unjust ordering of human beings in this world. That is the idea that earthly hierarchies are in place as a result of the fall. And this is in keeping with Augustine's suggestion in Book 19 of the City of God, that earthly dominion had been imposed upon mankind as punishment for sin. But again, it doesn't follow from this that were it not for Elizabeth Anderson's authoritarian doctrine of original sin, that Christians like Augustine and Gregory would have drawn egalitarian conclusions. Again, that's not what's going on. So we're going to jump a little bit forward to the Summa Theologiae, in which Aquinas discusses this problem directly with reference both to Gregory and to Augustine. Now, query 96. Article 3 asks whether men were aequales in the state of innocence. So after considering what Aquinas takes to be Gregory's view in the affirmative, yes, they were, Aquinas draws on Augustine's authority to argue the contrary, namely that man's equality by nature was consistent with natural as well as civil subordination. So according to Aquinas, there must have been order in unfallen creation as a reflection of God's perfection. And since order consists in disparity, as Augustine himself argued, there must have been disparity in the state of innocence, not only of sex and strength, but of authority and obedience. And I think Aquinas's reasoning here is really instructive. So if you go in Article 4, dominium, that is the power of masters over slaves, he tells us, was introduced after the fall as a correction for sin. But man's natural equality before the fall was nonetheless consistent with other forms of subjection and indeed dominion. So Aquinas wants to kind of reclaim that word, namely the political rule of those who are naturally free for the common good. And here we just got to remember that Aquinas is trying to be an orthodox Aristotelian, so he's very much drawing on the politics here. But here, this is not something you're going to find in Aristotle. Thomas cites as evidence the angelic hierarchy. In other words, if hierarchy was good enough for the angels in their state of innocence, well, why wouldn't it be appropriate for human beings in theirs? To a modern egalitarian, the idea that equality and hierarchy are consistent is obviously nonsense. But to understand Aquinas's point, we've got to remember that the term hierarchy, which in Greek means literally holy office or rule, originated in Christian theology, and compared with the other terms we've been discussing, namely equalitas and paritas, hierarchy is actually a really late coinage. It's a 6th century coinage, and it originates with a Platonist theologian who styled himself as Dionysius the Areopagite, which was a reference to the Athenian converted by Paul in Acts 17. So over 2 treatises, this pseudo-Dionysius developed a vision of hierarchy as divinely and rationally sanctioned and centrally ordered government that was appropriate both to heaven and earth. So the celestial hierarchy of the angels reigned in heaven, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the church reigned down below. Now notice that in both forms of hierarchy, celestial and ecclesiastical, hierarchs, so holy officers, be they archangels or archbishops, belong to the same natural species and hence to the same existential rank as their fellow creatures. Nevertheless, the ranks are internally as well as externally ordered. So accordingly, hierarchy as a form of rule is not only political, it's also a form of pedagogical and pastoral authority. So hierarchs have authority over inferiors, and it's their job to help those inferiors placed beneath them in the existential hierarchy to ascend through their respective ranks and make progress in virtue. Ultimately, the aim for all creatures on this Christian Platonist cosmology is to ascend the rank as far as possible and make progress towards reunion with the creator, namely God. Now, some of you will recognize this kind of this Christian Platonist form of hierarchy as the great chain of being, which was popularized by Arthur Lovejoy. And I'm not going to say any more about that for now, beyond just pointing out that Jeremy Waldron, again, is just simply wrong in the passage I cited earlier when he suggested that it's a striking implication of this sort of ranking of species in the great chain of being, that within each rank, everything is equal. That's just not the case. There is order within ranks as well as without ranks. So rather, as Aquinas points out, relations of subordination and subjection could and did exist within ranks, of which the members were, strictly speaking, equales. So this might reflect the differential degrees of spiritual progress individuals had made, but it might also reflect their natural disparities of virtue, of strength, of sex. So Locke's own, and here I think this is really important, Locke's own admission of certain forms of natural subordination in the 17th century as consistent with natural equality is simply a latter-day reflection of this much older idea. So on this Christian Platonist view, the social orders and distinctions imposed on earth were necessarily imperfect reflections of divine order. Still, the point of natural equality for Aquinas, as for Gregory or Lactantius, was ultimately that human beings were not equal or pares with respect to their value or worth. Their indifference, though, with respect to species and their shared participation in the human condition would enable God and other equal judges to compare and rightly order them in any case. So Acts 10:34 remained a very important proof text. Earthly judges would do their best to preserve the imperfect semblance of divine order on earth, knowing that God would see to it that the scales were balanced in the hereafter. So Pseudo-Dionysius' theory of hierarchy points us towards one last area of Christian theology crucial for understanding the relationship between equality, parity, hierarchy, and etc. in pre-modern thought. And for those of you, maybe some of you know it's coming, but here I have in mind the Trinity. Now, it's not going to shock you, I think, to learn that debates about the Trinity have been ignored by political theorists. And you're in luck. I'm not actually going to go into any of them in any detail because I'm running out of time. But I just want to point out that debates about the Trinity are really important for the evolution of the concept of equality, precisely because the equality of the persons, personae of the Trinity, that is Father, Son, and Spirit, became dogma in the 6th century as part of the Athanasian Creed. Now, for those of you keeping track, you'll see that while the equality of the persons of the Trinity is just a logical implication of the unity of the persons of the Trinity. If equality is an aspect of unity, then the Trinity has all aspects of unity, therefore the persons are equal. But of course, how a father and son can be equales to one another, well, that was no less hotly debated a topic as whether or not there was disparity and order in the state of innocence. Okay, you've all been extraordinarily patient, and I am going to point us now towards the conclusion. It should be clear from what I've said thus far that before the 17th century, the equality of human beings did not have egalitarian political, social, or economic consequences. Certainly not the ones that modern political theorists and philosophers expect. Because men were equales but not pares by nature, hierarchical distinctions could always be justified by the manifest disparities between them. Civil magistrates could and should emulate the virtue of equalitas in the administration of justice in particular cases. Nevertheless, they must do so while respecting the distinctions of kind and class, that is, of personae, enshrined in civil law. Accordingly, natural equality as indifference was never absent from pre-modern theology or jurisprudence. So, in fact, it became only more prominent in the 16th century when certain Catholic natural lawyers decided to stress the salience of the indifference principle, if you will, to the creation of political power. So here we have Robert Bellarmine, but also Francisco Suarez, arguing that because human beings were equales by nature, there was no reason why a God of equal justice would elevate one man as master of the rest. So notice that natural law theories are often described as though everyone was running around the state of nature with equal rights. That's not how these initial arguments work. It's really a power vacuum. And because God is rational and God is just, there's no criterion or basis upon which a just God would elevate any one man. So power must reside in the whole body. That these arguments subsequently became popular among Protestants seeking to constrain and even resist their often Catholic sovereigns is well known. Indeed, by 1631, they'd become so ubiquitous in England that Locke's bête noire, Sir Robert Filmer, could complain that the supposed natural equality of mankind had become what he called, quote, a truth unquestionable. Hence, equity required that an ear be reserved a little for the negative. So Robert Filmer is complaining that everyone's saying human beings are equal. Spare a thought for the idea that there might be a divine right monarchy. Okay, so this whistle-stop tour that I've just taken you on of equality before egalitarianism in Western, or really Western Christian political thought, is necessarily incomplete, right? However, I hope to have convinced you of a few things. Firstly, that contrary to the expectations of most contemporary political theorists and philosophers, the basic equality of human beings is not only ancient, but that it's functioned for most of its history as a normatively hierarchical principle. So for a judge with the virtue of equalitas, the natural indifference of humans as members of the same species, all indifferently subject to the natural law, whatever their station, served as the basis on which to make just distinctions between them based on their disparate merit. And so in this view, Not only are equality and hierarchy not antonyms, rather it's strictly equal treatment of equalis that needs justification, not the other way around. And within the existential ranks of creation, betters have a corresponding duty to be better, while all of God's creatures have a duty to do and be their best. And again, there's an aspect of the image of God here that's been forgotten, but in these Christian Platonist accounts, the image of God in man is a reminder that we have to do our best to become more God-like, so as to become closer to God despite our perfection. We've got to live up to the image of God in us. But I want to conclude by just pointing again to the importance of the conceptual distinction that I made earlier between equality and parity, because I think it allows us to say something even more. Specifically, it allows us to see that the normativity of pre-modern equalitas derived from its status as a virtue of balanced judgment. And often what a balanced judge would be doing would be making discernments of individuals, whether or not they were pares or on a par. And so I've used the word discernment here, but maybe I'll use an even more provocative term and say discrimination. So in the assessment of pares, it's not like equality. You can't just measure them because they don't share a unit of measure. Instead, if we're going to discern or discriminate pares, those who are pares from those who aren't, we're going to use contrastive and comparative judgments. So again, here, I think it's just really madness to say that the kind of hierarchically ordered exclusions that characterize the prehistory, or really the history of equality, that these are philosophically uninteresting failures of reasoning, just neglects the fact that they're actually rational and coherent expressions of equalitas as a normatively hierarchical principle. So we can't simply dismiss them or read them out. We've got to really assess them as part of theories and practices that are important indeed, I'm going to argue in the book, for how we continue to think about equality today. So in the rest of the book, I'm going to argue that really natural equality wasn't doing the work at all. It was a different principle. It was the principle of natural parity. I get the sense, I can't actually see the time, Jacob, but I get the sense that I'm running out of time. Can you give me a thumbs up if I'm out of time? I'm almost out of time. Okay, so I won't go into why Lactantius didn't draw the conclusions that we would expect from natural parity. I'm just going to plump for the kind of work that I'm doing in this lecture and in the book and say that the first thing we've got to do in order to be able to properly account for and tell the story of equality before egalitarianism is pay attention to vocabulary and pay attention to the languages used. So as you've seen already in this presentation, modern commentators, modern translators just conflate equality and parity routinely. But for the attentive reader who is willing to go to the Latin text themselves, well, you might actually notice some telltale traces of where the action really was. So here we're going to end with what Jim Scott might call a hidden transcript, a telltale trace in the historical record that offers a glimpse of traditional Christian assertions of natural equality giving way to something more. So as one of the instigators of the 14th century peasants' revolt in England, the preacher John Ball was often cited, or is often cited today, as an early egalitarian. But consider how the monk Thomas Walsingham recorded Ball's sermon in his chronicle. From the beginning, all men by nature were created, not equales, but pares. And our bondage and servitude came in by the unjust oppression of wicked men. So when Adam, Dolph, and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? Well, when you understand parity on the model of English peerage, this begins to have incredibly radical and revolutionary consequences. Thank you very much. So let me see if I can stop sharing my screen. Great.
Great, thank you very much, Teresa. In the introduction, I mentioned Teresa's comment in an essay on Rawls that many political philosophers and political theorists are prone to present the history of political thought in a way that teleologically results in their own current works in progress. And here I think we've seen the value in not doing that, in showing the paths that haven't been taken in the history of political thought in order to unsettle taken for granted assumptions about how something like a theory of equality works. A comparably subversive and curmudgeonly moment from Professor Bejan's work is in an interview with Quentin Skinner, no less, the arguably the greatest living historian of political thought, in which she just directly challenged him on his neglect of the history of religious thought. And he was forced to concede the point and say, because I think that religion is, quote, nothing but nonsense, I don't find it interesting. And in virtue of not finding it interesting, I don't pay any attention to it in the ways that it might interact with the things that I do think are of consequence. And again, I think one of the real values of Professor Bejan's work over and over again is her push to political theorists and historians of political thought not to do that, and to acknowledge how important the history of religious thought has been to the history of moral and political thought, such that we cannot well understand the historical presuppositions of the things that we take for granted and the things that we think we know now, if we just systematically blind ourselves to work that has the word God in it. So thank you very much for that lecture. At the RGCS lecture series, the first question is reserved for a member of the RGCS Student Fellowship, and I'll ask that people use the raise hands function. I'll go ahead and call on the questioners. I filled in some time there, so I hope that someone from the Student Fellowship has prepared a question while I was doing so. Nessie.
Hello. I was wondering about the distinction that you draw in the Roman context between civil law and natural law, and how then do these Roman thinkers justify the existence of civil law? What is the source of its legitimacy, if not the laws of nature and God? Because isn't that supposed to be the foundation of how we judge each other in that Christian society?
Well, obviously this is a big question, and it's going to become the question for the reception of the civil law in Western Christendom. So, I don't want to speak out of school here. I'm no expert on Roman jurisprudence, but the sense is that the authority of the civil law in Rome is the auctoritas of the people of Rome. So, right, so Stoics or Stoic sympathizers like Cicero are going to offer an account about how this is all consistent. So it's all reason in various forms, reflected variously. But really the Roman conception is that the civil law has a civic foundation. And in Rome, that is a civic kind of popular foundation in the Roman people, which then authorizes and gives force to the law. But again, the question itself it is the question, and there's no one answer to it. And so I think it is really interesting to trace that forward. But I would say, actually, I think more historians of political thought have paid more attention to the reception of this of civil law in Christian Europe than they have to kind of what I'm focusing on. So I'll leave that to them, and then keep on focusing on the minutiae.
And after the first question, the floor is generally open. Abby.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I guess my question, you kind of detail how this equality in the pre-modern times is predicated on most of these situations on kind of the inequality of women and slaves and these other classifications within society. And I guess I'm wondering, is there anything then within this pre-modern conception of equality, is this useful to us in contemporary society where we do value the more radical egalitarianism, or is in what context then can we how do we understand this, I guess, in our modern context? Is it just still a figment of these particular societies, or is there something worth taking forward with us?
So certainly one response to the kind of the history of equality before egalitarianism I presented here is saying, so much the better for egalitarianism, let's forget about the prehistory and just get on with it. But part of what's motivated me to kind of resuscitate or sort of rediscover this history is the worry, but maybe it's less than worry, just simply the observation that for equality to be meaningful, we still rely quite a lot on constitutive exclusions. So we don't exclude in the same ways that we did. Nevertheless, I mean, this is something that Jacob's written about plenty, but just the distinction between citizens and human beings in liberal thought does quite a lot of work, and the kind of equality that's meant to kind of govern relations between citizens is quite a lot more demanding than the kind of equality that governs relations between human beings. And that's led people like Sam Moyn to just, to conclude not enough, we've got to do more. But my response to Sam would be, well, the concept of equality isn't enough. Really, we're sort of overburdening this single concept with kind of every demand that we would make of social and political life in each other. And so in recovering parity, I'm doing that because I think it's conceptually important. I think very often when we appeal to equality, we're actually talking about parity. But also just because I think that we can speak and understand each other better if we speak precisely about what it is we care about. And just so on a final note, I mean, to really sort of rile you up, Abby, I'm going to say that part of what's motivating me is the kind of frustration with the way that sometimes we can talk about inclusion as always and everywhere good, as though inclusion is uncontroversially good in all cases. I think that, institutions depend on excluding and excluding well, and excluding in justified ways. And so really political theorists, if we care about equality and if we care about parity, we've also got to sort of face up to exclusion and sort of think about it. We can't just sort of say, oh, well, that's philosophically uninteresting and I've just sort of, had a blind spot. No.
The foils here have regularly made appearances at RGCS or the Lynn Center. Sam Moyn visited a couple of years ago. Elizabeth Anderson gave the Lynn Center annual lecture 2 years ago, and Jeremy Waldron gave the very first lecture in the RGCS lecture series some 9 years ago now. I have next Itai Sher on the list.
Hi, thanks for a very nice talk. So my question is, you talk about how equality doesn't imply egalitarianism, or not necessarily, and you appeal to these, distinctions within equality. But what about appealing to something else which is common, which is when we talk about equality conditional on something. So if you're equality before the law, it doesn't mean that people who've committed crimes are treated in the same way as people who haven't, but we think it shouldn't be conditional on gender, for example. And we also talk about equality of what? So it could be equality of the length of punishment or equality of the suffering, and those might be incompatible. Are those categories, equality condition, what should matter and what shouldn't matter, conditional on what, and equality of what, sufficient or insufficient to explain these, this sort of older conception of equality, or do we have to really appeal to different notions of equality?
Yeah. So the points. Well, first, it's nice to meet you. But the point's well taken. I'm really starting this project. I mean, I know it's extremely historical and maybe even, perish the thought antiquarian, but I'm really starting from very kind of current debates in egalitarian theory between relational egalitarians and other kinds. And so in a way, I kind of want to sort of step back to the prior step before the different kinds of equality, legal, political, etc., and just try to really unpack what we mean by describing each other as equals. Right. So Dworkin influentially sort of says, well, equality doesn't demand equal treatment. It demands that we treat others as equals. And then this was sort of universally embraced and said, oh, great, that yes, let's treat each other as equals. But what I'm interested in is just, I don't actually think conceptually you can make that move in the way that he thought you could make it. So, so yeah, I mean, I would just say, it's all interesting. I think that it's important, but that actually there's a sort of prior step that we haven't really considered, which is just, what are the conceptual foundations upon which we're making any of these claims? And I would just say that just on your point, I mean, it's a point that my colleague Stuart White has made and made very well, but still, that way of looking at the question is still treating the idea that individuals share a kind of status as equal and equally free. That is itself the kind of thing that I'm trying to work out where that came from. Because if you'll see in my story that the idea that individual persons could be equal is just not, conceptually, I don't know where you would place that claim in the kind of story that I've been laying out. Anyway, that's kind of where I want to get in.
Shall.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. I'm wondering how the way that you've conceptualized equality and forced this reconceptualizing of it in the broader history of political thought might then lead to a reconsideration of how we view justice, both in the history of political thought more generally and specifically in Christian political thought, where it certainly plays a crucial role in, for instance, divine right.
So you don't just want me to write the history of equality, you want me to write the history of justice? I mean, come on, I can't do it, I can do everything. Anyway, it's nice to meet you too. So certainly I'm interested in pointing out historically where the association between equality and justice comes from. And as I've outlined it for you here, it's simply that, equality actually just means even or level. And we're analog, right? We're working with scales where we're measuring things. We're actually looking about whether or not the scale is even or level. And so I think a lot of this, I mean, I'm interested really in revisiting the work of Gregory Vlastos on equality and justice for this reason, because he is a specialist in ancient political philosophy. He writes amazingly about it, but he is motivated by this frustration with Aristotle for sort of getting it wrong or sort of discounting sort of the egalitarianism of equal shares. And again, I just think I mean, I know that with Jacob, I'm sort of preaching to the converted and I need to convince you all that this is the case. But I think, as scholars, we can never sort of break free of our own context. We're always going to go to the past with our kind of contemporary questions and preoccupations. But that's why we have to be really careful about our concepts and simply not impose kind of modernist conceits on past arguments. And I just think in the way that we've been thinking about equality and specifically egalitarian justice, we haven't gotten to the ground of kind of what the connection is for the people we're reading. So yeah, I hope it's okay, but I'm gonna punt on the question of the history of justice.
The nice thing about moving the lectures to the online setting is that some of our program's alumni are able to come back and stop in, including Mary Jo.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was so interesting, and I feel like it's so rare that I learn this much in a single hour, so it's been really exciting. So I had a question basically about whether you had a story of when equality does start to take on these sort of non-hierarchical implications. Because, so one text that came to my mind that struck me as very similar to Anderson is Sarah Schapone, who was writing about the hardship of English wives in 1735. And she makes a very similar point to Anderson. She says that earthly hierarchy is the product of original sin, and specifically the subjection of wives to husbands is a result of Eve's particular transgression. So for Schapone, she does seem to think like Anderson that like hierarchy is the product of sin, and that if Eve didn't have this particular transgression in the original sin, then men and women would be treated the same and do have equal worth. So I'm wondering if maybe, I totally buy your argument that the pre-moderns don't have any sort of hierarchical implications when they invoke equality, but I'm wondering if in the 17th century, or at least for Schapone in the 18th century, it does start to take on this meaning.
Definitely. Are you still working on Locke?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, I do want to hear an update. Yeah, certainly I do have a story. And so as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, this is basically the first substantive chapter of a book, which is going to be 6 chapters. And the argument in the book is that something does change decisively in the 17th century in English political thought. Now, I don't want to make any broader claims about how the change happens elsewhere. So really, this is quite a whistle-stop tour. I mean, this is quite a, I'm surveying a lot of time and distance in this first chapter, but in the subsequent chapters, it becomes very, very narrow and very sort of micro, looking at the micro level in terms of theories and practices of equality in the 17th century in England, and specifically looking at the 1640s and 50s. So my argument in the book is that we're wrong to look to philosophers and theorists like Hobbes and Locke as the originators of a kind of egalitarian argument, because what they're doing is responding to the practical claims that were being made by levelers, diggers, and Quakers on the basis of these older traditions of thought. So again, it's a story of complexity, and it's also a story of how practice and theory interrelate. So yes, I mean, it's, again, Jacob's very kind, and he doesn't criticize me for what he should criticize me for, which is that, of course, my own telling of this is culminating in my own work in progress. And it just so happens that the thing I'm looking for happens in the period on which I happen to be an expert, right? So, klaxons, we should worry. So I'm really excited sort of by doing this project. I want to hear from people who specialize on other periods and other, especially in other linguistic traditions, to understand how it looks elsewhere. But yeah, this is the English story, and it's a story happening in a particularly Anglophone, Christian, and common law context.
Charlie Richards.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I think I learned a lot, especially as one of the modern egalitarians that probably take a lot for granted that you talk about in your talk. So I have like 2 very quick questions. So the first question is, when the pre-moderns are thinking about equality, how much of the distinction between equality as a practice and equality as a property maps onto pre-modern thought in this? And this was particularly triggered by notions from difference between civil equality and natural law equality, that whether that's doing any work in the notion of a practice and a property. That's kind of my first question. The second question, which I think you touched on a little bit in your talk, is the role of dignity and how that relates to equality. So modern egalitarians, especially Dworkin, which you mentioned, and Waldron as well, they talk a lot about equal dignity, and they characterize it as very much a Christianic idea, the idea that persons are equal in their dignity before God or something like that. So when these pre-modern thinkers, these kind of Christianic thinkers, are thinking about equality, how detachable is that idea from notions of dignity as we might assume today that they're not? So how much can we bring those ideas apart in ways that perhaps we would assume that they shouldn't be or couldn't be on a Christianic tradition? Thanks very much.
Yeah, great. Well, great question. And also, shouldn't you be in bed? Isn't it very late where you are? Anyway, yeah, great questions. So just on the first one about practice and theory, it's such an important question, and it is something that I want to put at the forefront of my discussion, as opposed to sort of putting practice on the back burner, which I think very often political theorists can tend to do. Certainly in this chapter, the action is in the law, right, and in the sort of civil magistrates' courts. So I think I am vulnerable to a very important criticism, which is that I'm not engaging at all deeply, or maybe even at all, with the kind of concrete sites of courtrooms and how personae appeared. And it's a question I'm interested in. It's just, again, I've got to sort of concede eventually that I'm not a specialist in everything, and sort of, just accept that. But I do think it is really important, because then as now, when we think about sort of theoretical claims like human beings are equal by nature, we understand those claims and imagine their meaning in light of the practices and experiences and the concrete sites in which we encounter other people, right? And so a big part of the story I tell in the 17th century is just like, what are the practices that are informing what, you know, what a leveler or what a Quaker means when she calls someone else her equal. And so there, that points to the other sort of practical context, which is really important, and that Lactantius alludes to, which is the context of the early Christian churches, and specifically the mutual denomination of Christians as brothers, right? And so a story that I'm going to carry forward is just how important kind of egalitarian practices of respecting and disrespecting by wearing particular kinds of clothing, by doffing and donning their hats or not, by even using particular pronouns, were to the constitution of these sites or these small societies of equals that then began to turn their arguments outward. So on the second question about dignity, I think that one of the things, I know that, you know, oh, poor Jeremy. I mean, I know like every book I write is just sort of Jeremy Waldron is wrong for this reason. But actually, the great thing about Jeremy Waldron is that he's wrong in such interesting ways. But one thing he says in the equality book, which I think is really right, is that basic equality, equal worth, human dignity, they're not equivalent. They're a kind of constellation of concepts that travel together. And you see that historically. Certainly the idea that, certainly, I mean, as you saw in my talk, dignity is on the table, and the idea that personae have different dignities. So all Roman citizens share in the dignity of the Roman civitas, but they all have different dignities as a matter of civil law. That's an important part of the story. But my beef with Waldron is that, again, it's not the idea that every human individual has a particular dignity, and it's an equal dignity in virtue of his or her membership in the human race. That idea simply isn't there. Certainly, it's not there in Genesis. And so again, the story of how that idea sort of comes about is, I think, a story, as I alluded to, about the kind of migration of the person inward. And that's a story that I'm going to be telling in the context of John Locke in particular, because of course that Locke, one of the things he does in the essay concerning human understanding is pioneer this conception of personality as a forensic term, as he calls it. Right. So that story, but again, you know, as in my response to Mary Jo, that's a kind of theoretical response to practical demands that are being made on the ground by basically a lot of enthusiastic Christians. So thanks.
We may end up with time for one more question, but before we get to the one more question, I want to take the minutes to give away a copy of Mere Civility to a current McGill student who's on the pre-registration list. We have 120 on the pre-registration list. I have my D12 and D10 in my hands. Number 27 will be Simon Philotro. I didn't see that name on the list today. Simon, speak up if you're here. Otherwise, I re-roll. 117. Anna Pringle. We had some losses over the last 10 minutes, but if you're not here when I roll, then you're not here.
They all already have the book, Jacob. I mean,
28. Aviel, are you here? Helena. Helena should be here.
Oh, is that me?
That's you, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
All right. You'll be in touch with Nina about getting your copy of the book. Catherine, is your question one that could be squeezed in 2 minutes?
Sure. Hi, Teresa. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. so my question is sort of asking you to come out explicitly about how we do theory. So I'm wondering whether basically if we are understanding one of the purposes of your project, it's really to say like concepts like equality, no matter how well you theorize them, really don't necessarily lead to any emancipatory project or lead to anything terrible either. It's so a lot matters on the context in which these terms are used and conceptualized and practiced. And so just as equality sometimes can serve exclusionary or inclusive or hierarchical or emancipatory projects, I mean, I think there is a battle there that you must be fighting. And, you know, I'm reading a book now on Kant and how it's Kant's racial hierarchy that actually leads him to argue for cosmopolitan right. It's not on a basis of egalitarianism. This is Inés Valdez's book on transnational cosmopolitanism. So you know, again, combining your work with that, it seems to be a real challenge for, I think, normative theorists who tend not to focus on the context in which, you know, they develop the understanding of these concepts.
Well, I think you said that very well. So, no, thanks for pushing me. And yeah, I am, as a historian of political thought, I'm shamelessly presentist. I mean, this is a normative project as well as a historical one. Right, and I mean, there's sort of two things going on. One, I think that political theorists tend to be quite naive about the relationship between theory and practice. We tend to treat it as a sort of unidirectional arrow where theory leads to practice. We theorize, then we apply it, right? And so, you know, obviously that leads to debates about, you know, ideal, non-ideal theory, etc. But what I want to sort of remind us as a historian is that, well, no, the arrow runs both ways. And more particularly, you know, I think as you brought out nicely, there's a kind of empty, I mean, the emptiness of equality talk has been observed, right? I mean, there are plenty of articles about the emptiness of equality. But I think the emptiness here really has to do with a theorizing equality. And part of the attraction of equality is that it's just so beautifully abstract, right? But for equality to matter, and I think Anderson's really right about this, we have to actually be grounded in egalitarian practices and egalitarian struggles. Now, where I depart from Anderson is, again, I think she's quite naive about, and I think she's historically naive about the way that so-called egalitarian movements function and reproduce their own forms of exclusion. So, you know, Mary Jo referred to Sarah Chapone. The final chapter in the book is about Mary Astell and kind of early feminists who observe that all of these men who are demanding equality are in fact demanding to be peers, secure in their superiority over women. And so I don't think that in being aware of practical contexts, we're suddenly going to dissolve that problem. I think that problem is pretty endemic. You know, if we want to constitute a society of equals, there's going to be exclusion and we have to reckon with that. But I do think, for my own part, historically informed political theory is the way that I keep this kind of interplay between theory and practice at the forefront of my mind when I'm thinking about equality and justice and everything else. And it makes me really concerned, just practically in my own life, about the constitution of sites of parity. So just thinking about, you know, pedagogy as a political practice. What are we doing in a seminar room? We're trying to constitute a space wherein individuals can meet one another as pares. And there's hierarchy involved in that. There's exclusion involved in that. Nevertheless, there's a really important kind of paritarian sensibility that goes in, and then people can take outside of that space into other spaces. So again, it's a micro-political project, and so I'm kind of, you know, in touch with relational egalitarianism in that way. But as you say, there's also kind of methodological as well as a normative dimension to it.
Wonderful. The student fellows and Teresa all have a link where we will reconvene in 15 minutes after taking a breather. And those of you who are in a position to emulate what you would have been doing at our reception, feel free to bring a drink to our conversation in 15 minutes. The next RGCS lecture will be given by Anthony Appia of New York University 3 weeks from today on quote, what about the workers? And for today, please join me in thanking Teresa Bejan.
Thank you guys, and thanks for wonderful, wonderful questions. And thanks for joining me from all around the world.